The Young and the Restless Spoilers Shock. There are nights in Genoa City when danger does not arrive like a storm but like a whisper, a private weakness, a bad instinct indulged one time too many. This is one of those stories, the kind that begins far from home under the hard artificial glow of Las Vegas, where every promise is overpriced, every temptation is dressed as freedom, and every mistake waits patiently to become permanent. What makes this unraveling so compelling is not simply the threat of violence, but the uglier truth underneath it. Revenge only becomes this precise when pain has been fed for a long time. And in this mess, every person thinks they are trying to survive, even as they become the reason someone else is falling apart. That is why this storyline works so well in theory when handled carefully. It is not just about whether Nick can outmaneuver Matt, or whether Noah and Sienna can escape the consequences of whatever came before. It is about fear turning intelligent people into reckless ones, about old rivalries mutating into obsessions, and about the moment pride becomes more dangerous than any enemy in the room. Sienna feels it first, in the way panic starts to settle into her body before she can even explain it. Fear like that is never random. It comes from pattern recognition, from the silent accumulation of small details that no one else takes seriously until it is too late. She has already seen enough of Matt to understand that he is not driven by ordinary anger. He is driven by humiliation, and humiliation is always one of the most volatile emotions in any story, because it does not simply want payback, it wants reversal. It wants the person who caused the wound to feel smaller, weaker, more exposed than the original victim ever did. That is why Sienna's terror matters. She is not screaming into the void, she is sensing that the shape of this danger is shifting. For a while, it may have seemed as though she and Noah were the center of Matt's rage, the most visible targets, the easiest symbols of everything he feels was taken from him. But the deeper truth is more troubling. Nick is not just another obstacle in Matt's way. Nick is the one Matt needs to break to satisfy something much darker inside himself. When Sienna confides this fear to Noah, it forces him into a role he never fully wanted but can no longer avoid. Noah has always lived with the burden of being a Newman without always embracing the brutality that sometimes comes with that name. He carries decency like a stubborn habit, and under normal circumstances that would make him the moral center of a crisis. But morality becomes complicated when the threat is no longer abstract. Once the danger acquires a face, a plan, and a clock, Noah has to confront the possibility that being decent may not be enough to protect the woman standing in front of him, trembling under the weight of intuition. That is where his conflict becomes rich. He wants to reassure Sienna to tell her that Matt will not get near Nick, that things have not gone too far, that there is still a line no one will cross. But Noah knows better. Men like Matt stop fearing consequences when obsession becomes identity. At that point, they are not reacting to the world anymore. They are trying to rewrite it. Sienna's greatest mistake may have been underestimating the hierarchy of Matt's hatred. She understood that he wanted to punish her. She understood that Noah represented a life Matt could not control. But she miscalculated the emotional geometry of revenge. Nick is the axis. Nick is the wound that never closed. Whatever history lies between them, however much resentment has been swallowed, postponed, or disguised as rivalry, it has clearly matured into something venomous. Matt can want to hurt Noah and Sienna and still reserve his deepest cruelty for Nick, in a way that makes this more terrifying, not less, because it means the attacks on Noah and Sienna were never the endgame. They were pressure points, collateral emotional damage designed to destabilize the man Matt truly wants to destroy. That kind of strategy says a lot about Matt. It reveals patience, intelligence, and a willingness to weaponize other people's vulnerabilities without remorse. Personally, I think that is where this story becomes genuinely effective, because a villain is always more frightening when his violence is not impulsive but curated. Nick, meanwhile, steps into the most dangerous chapter of his own arc, not because he is ignorant, but because he is tired. That distinction matters. Recklessness born of stupidity is one thing. Recklessness born of emotional depletion is far more tragic. By the time he makes the choice to buy fentanyl from a stranger in Las Vegas, he is no longer operating from strength. He is operating from erosion. Something in him has already been worn down enough to make self-destruction feel like strategy. That is the most haunting possibility here. Maybe he tells himself he needs an edge, maybe he convinces himself he is keeping up appearances, staying functional, staying ahead. Maybe he believes he can control the dosage, the timing, the effect. But addiction-adjacent choices in soap storytelling are rarely about chemistry alone. They are about a person deciding, consciously or not, that the risk of collapse is preferable to the humiliation of helplessness. Nick is a man who has spent much of his life believing that action is always better than passivity. So, when he feels cornered, he does what men like him often do. He acts first and examines the consequences later. Las Vegas is the perfect setting for that descent because it flatters denial. It tells every wounded person that they are still in charge while quietly emptying them out. Under those neon lights, Nick's decision to buy fentanyl becomes more than a bad choice. It becomes a symbolic surrender to the kind of darkness he would normally despise in others. And then comes the extra item, the second offer, the mysterious addition that transforms a reckless move into a potentially orchestrated trap. This is where the story tightens with real menace. A drug purchase is already volatile, but an unsolicited bonus changes the moral temperature of the scene. It suggests surveillance, it suggests planning. It suggests someone knew what Nick would seek, when he would seek it, and how vulnerable he would be when approached. If Matt arranged that transaction, then this is no longer a story about a man losing control. It is a story about one man engineering another man's loss of control so that the eventual confrontation becomes less a fight and more an execution disguised as chaos. What makes Nick so compelling in this setup is that his pride will almost certainly make everything worse. He's not the kind of man who likes to be pitied, and he especially does not want to be managed by his family. If he suspects he is being watched, manipulated, or protected, some ugly part of him will reject help simply because accepting it would feel like defeat. That is the cruel genius of Matt's approach if he is indeed behind it. He does not need Nick to die immediately. He needs Nick impaired, paranoid, angry, and humiliated. He needs him entering the decisive moment already fractured from within. A compromised Nick is easier to bait, easier to misjudge, easier to isolate, and the most painful part is that Nick might understand all of this on some level and still keep going because self-awareness is not the same thing as self-rescue. Noah becomes the emotional hinge of the story because he's caught between generations of Newman damage. He knows what Nick is capable of at his best, but he also knows the family has a long history of confusing toughness with invincibility. Watching Nick spiral would force Noah to confront the possibility that the men he grew up seeing as protectors are also men who have normalized concealment, impulsiveness, and emotional denial. There is a kind of betrayal in that discovery even when no one intended to betray him. Noah may begin this chapter focused on protecting Sienna, but as the danger around Nick escalates, he is dragged into a more complicated crisis, whether to expose Nick's vulnerability to save him or respect Nick's pride and risk. Losing him, that is not an easy choice. In fact, that is the kind of choice that leaves scars regardless of outcome. If Noah intervenes, Nick may see it as interference and weakness. If Noah waits too long, he may never forgive himself. These are the kinds of dilemmas that make characters feel human rather than functional. And then there is Sienna, whose fear gradually transforms into something sharper than panic. Fear can turn into guilt when a person begins to suspect that their own presence accelerated the disaster. She may start asking herself whether she drew Matt's attention back into their orbit, whether her involvement with Noah deepened a grudge that would otherwise have burned out, whether her instincts should have been louder earlier, more insistent. It would be natural for her to feel responsible, even if she is not to blame. That emotional shift is important because it keeps her from becoming a passive damsel in the story. Instead, she becomes a woman navigating a moral nightmare, trying to determine whether speaking up will protect the people she cares about or merely trigger the explosion sooner. I actually think stories like this are strongest when they allow the frightened character to be perceptive rather than helpless. Sienna should not exist merely to be endangered. She should exist to recognize the truth before anyone else is ready to face it. Matt, on the other hand, becomes more dangerous the more he convinces himself that he is the only one being honest. That is often how obsession justifies itself. In his own mind, he is not the villain, he is the corrective force. He is the man who sees through the hypocrisy, who refuses to let the Newmans continue moving through life, untouched by the damage they cause. That internal narrative can make him chillingly calm. He may look at Nick's unraveling not as cruelty, but as balance being restored. He may believe Noah and Sienna deserve collateral pain because they chose the wrong side. That warped moral reasoning is what separates a wounded antagonist from a genuinely destructive one. He is no longer responding to specific offenses. He is building a philosophy around vengeance. And once a person begins treating revenge like justice, there is almost no limit to what they can permit themselves to do. The impending confrontation between Matt and Nick should feel inevitable long before it happens. Not because fate demands it, but because every choice being made narrows the exits. Nick's drug use, whether experimental, desperate, or manipulative in its own way, weakens his judgment. Matt's strategic pressure destabilizes the terrain. Noah's divided loyalties slow decisive intervention. Sienna's panic sharpens but may not yet translate into proof. The genius of this kind of plot lies in how each person contributes to the collision while trying, in their own flawed way, to prevent it. That is what real tension looks like. Not random shocks, but a slow tightening of circumstances until even the smartest move feels like the wrong one. One especially strong direction for the story would be for Nick to realize too late that he has been set up only after the substances have already distorted his perception. Imagine him entering a confrontation with Matt believing he still has command over his own mind, only to find that anger is arriving too fast, that his body is no longer listening properly, that time itself feels wrong. Suddenly, the old Newman confidence becomes horrifyingly unreliable. A man who built his life on instinct can no longer trust his instincts. That is psychological terror, and it is more effective than simple physical peril. Nick does not just risk losing the fight. He risks losing the certainty of who he is in the middle of it. If the story wants to cut even deeper, it should let Nick understand the symbolic meaning of his own fall. He has spent years carrying himself as the reasonable Newman, the one less corrupted by power, less theatrical than Victor, less volatile than Adam in his worst phases, less consumed by image than others around him. To be reduced now by chemicals, by manipulation, by desperation, would wound him in a profoundly masculine and personal way. He would not only fear death or exposure. He would fear becoming pathetic. That fear, in my view, is more explosive than physical pain, because shame is often what drives characters into their ugliest decisions. A shamed Nick might lash out at Noah, reject Sienna's concern, lie to Sharon or Victoria, or even double down on risk, simply to prove he is not broken. In that sense, Matt would already be winning before the first punch is thrown. Noah's response to that unraveling could become one of the most emotionally layered parts of the arc. Sons often want to save fathers or father figures without admitting that need out loud. There is love there, but also resentment, exhaustion, old disappointments. Noah may look at Nick and see both the man who protected him and the man whose worldview helped create this disaster. He may feel furious that Nick thought he had to handle Matt alone. He may feel equally furious that the Newman family's instinct is always secrecy first, vulnerability last. That frustration could harden into a defining choice. Noah might decide that loyalty no longer means silence. He could begin acting behind Nick's back, gathering information, tracing the Vegas connection, piecing together who sold the fentanyl and why the extra item was offered. In doing so, Noah risks becoming more like the family strategist he has often kept at a distance. That irony is delicious. The very crisis that proves how damaging Newman habits can be may also force Noah to adopt them. Sienna too may find herself pushed toward morally gray ground. If official channels feel too slow and Nick refuses help, she may decide that protecting Noah and exposing Matt requires deception. She could lie about where she is going, manipulate access to information, or even bait Matt into revealing himself. That would be entirely logical if written well. Fear rarely leaves good people morally untouched. It teaches improvisation. It teaches concealment. It teaches people to prioritize outcomes over purity, and once Sienna begins making those trade-offs, she becomes more deeply woven into the emotional fabric of the story. She is no longer just warning others about danger. She is participating in the fight against it and paying the psychological cost. Another effective layer would be the family response once signs of Nick's instability become impossible to ignore. The Newmans are experts at rallying in crisis, but they are equally skilled at turning concern into control. If Victoria or Sharon catches even a glimpse of what is happening, the resulting pressure could intensify Nick's isolation. Concern from family sounds loving on the surface, but to a proud man already under attack, it can feel like surveillance. And Matt, if he is observing from the shadows, would know exactly how to use that. He would understand that Nick does not need to be physically separated from his support system if he can be emotionally alienated from it instead. A few well-timed provocations, a few anonymous clues, a few staged appearances, and suddenly, Nick may begin suspecting everyone's motives. The most dangerous trap is not the one that captures the body. It is the one that convinces the victim he has no ally he can fully trust. The Vegas storyline also benefits from the city's emotional symbolism. Las Vegas is excess, but it is also anonymity. That matters because Nick's deterioration there would feel like a stripping away of identity. In Genoa City, he is always somebody's son, brother, father, rival, or ex-lover. In Vegas, he becomes just another man making a bargain in the dark. That reduction is brutal. It lowers him to the level where Matt can reach him most effectively, not as a Newman icon, but as a vulnerable human being ruled by impulse. And that is probably Matt's fantasy all along, not merely to beat Nick, but to force him out of the elevated self-image that has protected him for years. Still, the story should be careful not to make Matt too omnipotent. The most satisfying version of this plot is not one where he controls every variable like a magician, but one where he sets a vicious plan in motion and then underestimates the emotional unpredictability of his targets. That is where the real drama can bloom. Maybe he expects Nick to collapse completely, but Nick's stubborn survival instinct resurfaces in the worst moment. Maybe he assumes Noah will stay obedient and cautious, but Noah becomes aggressive and strategically brilliant. Maybe he thinks Sienna will freeze in fear only for her to become the first person to identify the supply chain, the dealer, the pattern, the hidden mechanism of his setup. Villains become far more interesting when their confidence starts to crack under the pressure of other people refusing to behave as expected. Even so, none of that guarantees safety. In fact, one of the strongest possibilities is that the confrontation happens before the truth is fully assembled. Nick, partially impaired and already angry, might track Matt down or be lured into a location designed to maximize chaos. Noah and Sienna, piecing things together too slowly, race toward a disaster that is already underway. By then, the physical clash matters less than the emotional detonations around it. Nick may accuse Matt of things he cannot yet prove. Matt may finally say enough to confirm that this was never mainly about Noah or Sienna. He may reveal that breaking Nick has always been the point, that all the rest was merely scaffolding. And in that moment, Nick would have to face the unbearable truth that some enemy has studied him closely enough to know exactly how to hollow him out before the final strike. I think the fairest way to read Nick in this story is neither to excuse him nor to condemn him too simplistically. He is responsible for his choices, including the catastrophic decision to seek fentanyl. But responsibility is not the same as narrative isolation. The environment around him matters. The enemy targeting him matters. The emotional fatigue that made self-endangerment feel tolerable matters. Good drama understands that accountability and compassion can coexist. Nick should be judged for crossing that line, but he should also be portrayed as a man collapsing under a convergence of pressure, ego, fear, and manipulation. That is richer than turning him into either a saint or a fool. As for Noah and Sienna, the aftermath of this ordeal should leave permanent marks on them. Even if they survive physically, they will not emerge with the same innocence about what rage can do to a person. Noah may lose whatever remained of his belief that family legacy can be separated from family damage. Sienna may realize that her instincts, frightening as they are, were right all along, and that knowing danger is coming does not necessarily mean one can stop it. There is a peculiar cruelty in that lesson. It hardens people. It changes the way they love. It changes the way they trust themselves. And Matt, regardless of whether he wins the immediate battle, is already revealing the emptiness at the core of revenge. A man can dedicate himself to destroying another and still remain unsatisfied, because vengeance rarely heals the original humiliation. It only repackages it into action. That is why the most powerful ending for this chapter would not be a neat triumph, but a scorched emotional landscape where everyone has lost something crucial. Nick may survive but lose credibility, self-respect, or trust. Noah may save him but fracture their relationship in the process. Sienna may expose Matt, but only after being dragged through terror that leaves her permanently changed. Matt himself may finally land his blow and discover that victory feels strangely hollow when the damage inside him remains untouched. This is what makes the storyline worth exploring beyond the surface shock of drugs, ambushes, and revenge. At its core, it is about wounded masculinity colliding with inherited pride, about women being forced to read danger faster than men are willing to admit it exists, about the seductive lie that control can be regained through risk. The best version of this arc should not rush toward spectacle alone. It should let the dread breathe. It should let every character carry the cost of their own flaw. Nick's flaw is pride dressed as resilience. Noah's flaw is believing he can mediate chaos without being transformed by it. Sienna's flaw is thinking insight alone can outrun obsession. Matt's flaw is the deadliest of all. He believes pain gives him the right to become monstrous.